Welcome. Good to have you tonight. Thank you for coming out again in the rain. And it's good to be here once again to continue our discussion of church history. We have completed now our examination of two periods of the church, and tonight we will begin into a new period of the church. But before we do, let's do a little review of where we have come from in order to get sort of a running start into where we are going. And so I'm going to ask you to turn your notes over, and we're going to have a little pop quiz, okay? The first age of the church. Did you? Excellent. Good. All right. We're going to start testing people. Membership will be dependent on your success. Most people are going, so. The first period of the church that we talked about was called the early church, okay? And what is the dominant theme of the early church? Persecution, okay? Can you tell me the dates of the early church? I'll let you round off. Up to about 300, from about 30 AD, with the ascension of Christ and the falling of the Spirit at Pentecost. Okay, so a period of time, roughly 300 years, okay? During this period of time, of course, we have the development of the canon of Scripture. Now, when I say the canon of Scripture, which part of the Bible am I referring to? The New Testament, correct. The Old Testament was well established by the time of Christ. So the 39 books of the Old Testament were already well known to Jesus. It's the 27 books of the New that had to be debated, and they had to be, well, first they had to be written, and then they had to be sent, and then they had to be read, and then they had to be debated, and then they had to be sent around to more people until eventually the church figured out that this was, in fact, the Word of God. So the canon of Scripture is developed in this time frame. Don't let anybody tell you that the church established the canon of the New Testament at Nicaea in 325. That is in error. The church was well established with a set of canonical books by about the middle part of the 2nd century, by about 150. Some of the books, like Jude and Revelation and Hebrews, took a little longer to be embraced, but they were in place by the middle part of the 3rd century. So by 250 at least, all of the books of the Bible as we know it were in place. During this time, we also had the definition of Orthodox Christianity established. During this period of time, what Christianity was well defined in this period of time. And we also have certain early heresies that were addressed in the early church. You'll get bonus points if you can tell me one of the heresies that appeared in this particular time frame. No. Gnosticism. Very good. That's bonus point. Well, close enough. Oh, Docetism. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. No, you were wrong. I have to remove the points. Okay. We went to the tape and we discovered instant replay. Yeah, Docetism comes a little later. In fact, Docetism won't even come until we get even further along in the Middle Ages. She's way ahead of us. That's right. Gnosticism, however, the belief in a special knowledge and understanding that began to invade Christianity, and even some of the later writers of the New Testament, like John, dealt with the subject in sort of its pseudo form before it really became a problem within the church. And then there were a number of early church fathers in this particular period of time that helped to solidify doctrine during this time. Anyone want to venture the name of one of the early church fathers? No. No. Early church fathers. Origen, excellent. Tertullian. Irenaeus. And a whole bunch of others. Now, we didn't spend a lot of time with them. That's why I kind of made it's a hard question, because I really didn't go into much of their lives. Okay, so that's the early church, a period of persecution leading to the establishment of Scripture, the definition of orthodoxy, and defense against certain early heresies. All right, so now we move into the second period, which was known as the imperial church. And what would be the common characteristic of this era in regards to the church? Yes, I suppose that's true, but that wouldn't be the primary characteristic of the church. What's the primary reality of the church during the imperial period? They were not under persecution, which means they were in a time of peace. Okay, so the church endured a time of peace, which led to an embrace of Christianity by Rome, and particularly by its leadership. You had Constantine being converted to the faith, which resulted in Christianity becoming the de facto religion of the empire, right? Okay. It was never, you remember, it was never declared to be the official religion, but it became sort of the de facto one just by virtue of the emperor himself becoming. Okay. Now, there was an increase in the size of Christianity as this new, quote-unquote, state religion took over. So certainly a lot more people called themselves Christians during this particular period of time. Now, what was the significant theological squabble that occurred in this particular period of time? What's that? No. Arianism. In your mind, you were thinking Arianism, but you said Gnosticism. Arianism, the chief problem that would occur during this particular time. Who can tell me what Arianism is?
Believing that salvation is in the power of the self.
No. You're close. You're very close. Right. In essence, Arianism is a conflict over the nature of who the second person of the Trinity is in relation to the first person of the Trinity. It's a Trinitarian problem. Who is the Son in relation to the Father? And Arianism was a belief that the Son was distinct from the Father and separate from the Father as a being created by the Father rather than being born of God, okay? Or being of God, the very begotten of God himself. So there was this particular theological squabble that continued, and the church debated through it. There were various individuals who addressed it, and there were two ecumenical councils that came together to address the issue. The first was Nicaea, and the second was the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople, which were two that apparently settled the issue, not entirely, but settled the issue. Nicaea addressed it, and then the East in Constantinople needed to have another council to deal with this issue later. You can get serious bonus points now if you can tell me without looking at your notes what dates Nicaea and Constantinople took place. Very good. Brett, Matt gets big ones for 325 for Nicaea. Now you're really going to get points if you can tell me when Constantinople was. Nope. 381. But you were so close. You were only 50 years off. You were so close. 325, 381, okay? Now, who were some of the most significant theologians in this particular period of time? I want three names. Athanasius is one. Augustine is another. And we talked about one other individual, a member of the Cappadocians, which was... His brother was Gregory of Nyssa. He was Basil the Great. Very good. Excellent. Matt's just pulling the points out tonight. He's just getting the points. Yep. Athanasius, of course, dealt with the issue of Arianism in the church, defending Nicene orthodoxy. Basil was involved in that later in the process towards the Council of Constantinople. And Augustine, of course, probably the greatest theologian outside of the Apostle Paul that has ever been launched in the history of the church, dealing with many, many issues in the course of his time here. And of course, during the imperial church, we see the expansion of the church outward. We looked at that, remember, with our little map, watching all the places that the Christian church went to, out to Persia, to the east, Arabia, to Ireland all the way in the north, Africa to the south, and so it went all over the known world at the time. Okay, so those are the two that we started with. So tonight we're going to move into the medieval church. The medieval church. The word medieval sounds ominous, but it really just means, it's just another way of saying the Middle Ages. Okay, so this is the church of the Middle Ages would be another way to say it. It's just easier to say medieval. We're going to date this period of the church from about 470 AD and the fall of the western side of the Roman Empire to roughly 1517, which some of you may recognize that date as the date that Luther tacked his 95 Theses to the door in Wittenberg. So you will notice it's a period of about more than 1,000 years. Now, it's called the Middle Ages for this simple reason. It exists between it exists as the middle between two other great periods of time. Okay? And there's three ways to look at it. First, you can look at it as the middle between classical antiquity, in other words, the ancient classical times, the imperial church being that time, and the Renaissance, or the new classical age that would eventually arise. So you can look at it as the middle time between old antiquity and new classical times. That's one reason that it's often called the Middle Ages. Another reason, of course, is it's the time between the Western Roman Empire falling and the rise of Western civilization, which really sort of begins somewhere in the Middle Ages, but it really comes to its fruition during the days of the Enlightenment and the days of the Renaissance. Western civilization as we know it has its roots going back deeper, but it's really sort of comes to its reality in the days of the Reformation. Okay? So we could look at it between those two mileposts, or we could look at it simply as the difference between the Orthodox Church, which was established and in place during the days of the imperial church, to a time in which it needed to be recaptured because it was lost. So you could look at it from the sense of an orthodoxy. In the imperial church, you have the various schisms over orthodoxy, but they're dealt with by councils, in which case Christianity has established itself as an orthodox religion. And then, for 1,000 years, that orthodoxy slowly drifts away and gets lost until God raises up men to come and attempt to recapture that orthodoxy. And so it's middle, if you will, between an orthodoxy on this end and an orthodoxy on this end. It's the middle period in between. Either way, any of these ways, it's 1,000 years of time. It is clearly the longest period of time in church history, because we are only about 500 years removed, as you can see, from the Reformation. Okay? So it is this particular period. Now, tonight, as we enter into a discussion of the medieval church, we need to start with the period that begins the Middle Ages. All right? And tonight I'm going to be talking to you about something called the Dark Ages. All right? I'm defining the Dark Ages as the period of Western history, after the fall of Rome, from roughly 450 to about 700. Okay, so a period of about 250 years, marked by frequent warfare and the virtual disappearance of urban life and high culture. The fall of the Roman Empire, the immediate aftermath, I should say, of the fall of the Roman Empire, ushers in a short period of time, 250 years in the grand scheme of things is short, a short period of time in which there is massive amounts of warfare. I'm going to call it barbarianism, and the loss of a good deal of high culture, which was prominent, of course, in Rome, and the loss of urban living. in the sense that the cities were no longer the population centers, but the populations moved out into the countrysides, okay? The Dark Ages represents this short window. Now, let me just clarify something. There are some who would insist that the entire Middle Ages is the Dark Ages. And you will read some historians who put it that way, who will say everything from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, or more specifically, everything from the fall of Rome to the Enlightenment, is in fact the Dark Ages. Because it is all during this period of time, and this is mostly secular writers who would say this, who would say that during this period of time, we lost in the West, we lost our footing in terms of our understanding of our world. The church, which became the harbinger of superstition, became the leading force governing the lives of people, and we needed an enlightenment in which science rose back up again to enlighten us about the world around us. So all, they would say, of the Middle Ages was a dark period, as there was no, according to them, no intellectual fervor, there was no sense of advancement scientifically, and the church was just superstitious and so forth. Now, there's something to be said for a lot of what I just said about the church, and as we talk about the Middle Ages, we're definitely going to be talking about a lot of superstition and a lot of sacramentalism and all kinds of weird things going on in the church in the West during that period of time, which all needed to be addressed, of course, at the time of the Reformation. But I'm more inclined to think of the Dark Ages, this is just my personal opinion, I'm more inclined to think of the Dark Ages as just that short window at the beginning. And then, as you come out of the 8th century into the 9th, you start to see the church in the West become more of a cultural influence and more of a harbinger of peace and order and structure in the world, which pushes back against the barbarian hordes to become more of a time in which you have a time of peace and a time of prosperity. And the church, the institutional, organized church, becomes the instrument by which that occurs. So the world, if you will, in the West, Europe, Europe and south of there, comes out from underneath this darkness of these barbarian invasions to once again recapture some semblance of urban life and high cultural living and so forth, which was lost during this period. So I'm not going to look at this from a strictly world history perspective. I'm really looking at it from a church history perspective, which is the church herself rose up at the beginning of the 9th century to become, if you will, a force in the world to make life better for people. Now, the downside of that, which we will discover through our discussions of the Middle Ages, is that that church then became wildly corrupt, okay, during that period of time. Because once you put an institutional church in place and you invest in its leadership all the power in the world, yes, they might be establishing culture and language and arts and so forth, but they're also drifting away in their power from the real essence of what Christianity is. Okay, so you have two tracks of thinking there, of the church being the instrument by which the world becomes more sane, but at the same time where Christianity itself begins to degrade. So we're going to see both of those things take place. All right, so let's talk about this dark period, this short dark period. Let's talk about the East first, okay, because all of our discussion for the next weeks is going to revolve around the West, okay, because it is the western side of the empire that falls. The eastern side, as you remember I said last week, remains in place for 1,000 years. So the western portion falls in the 5th century, but the eastern portion continued from Constantinople for almost the entire Middle Ages. The church will remain in the East relatively stable during the period of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, this empire is commonly referred to today as the Byzantine Empire, okay? But that's a bit of a misnomer. And the reason is because people who were living in that day in that part of the world would have considered themselves the Roman Empire. They called themselves Romanovs. They believed that they were part of the Roman Empire. Yes, the West fell. Rome itself fell. But from Constantinople to the east and around through Palestine and down into Africa, people consider themselves part of the continuing Roman Empire. Okay? And so the name Byzantine stuck later after men looked back upon that empire and tried to distinguish it from the West. So they used the name Byzantine to describe it, and that's named after the original name of the city that Constantine took as his capital and renamed as Constantinople. Its original name was Byzantium. And so that's why that name has stuck. It's not really the name of the empire at all. But so when we call it the Byzantine Empire, it's really more of the Eastern Roman Empire that continued for 1,000 years after the fall of the West. The empire would reach, the Eastern Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, would reach its greatest extent during the reign of Justinian I, around 565 AD. It would cover all of Asia Minor, which we call Turkey today, into Greece and much of Italy, going to the west, around to Palestine, and then around the curve into North and East Africa, including Egypt, Libya, all of the area to the north of Africa along the southern coast of the Mediterranean. So a big arc from Istanbul through Turkey, down through Syria, today into Palestine, into Lebanon and Israel, and down across into Egypt, below, south into Ethiopia, and then continuing west through Africa, the northern part of Africa. Okay? That's the Eastern Roman Empire. Greek thought would come to dominate this part of the empire. The Greek language and Greek thought were already a deep and embedded part of Constantinople, even by the time of Constantine when he came there. But Greek thought and Greek philosophy would become the primary way of thinking in regards to the Eastern Empire. In fact, the Eastern Orthodox Church today, even to today, finds its roots and language from Greece. It's not surprising that you would find some of the patriarchs of the Eastern Orthodox Church to be Greeks. And the Greek Orthodox Church, even today, is a part of that original continuing church in the East that continued on. The eastern portion of the empire would fall to the Muslims, the Ottoman Empire, in 1453. So it survives, as you can see, for another 1,000 years from the fall of Rome until the Turks overrun it and now own that territory, which we now call Turkey. Okay? The West, as I said last week, is broken. There is no centralized government, and so now it becomes small little bits of power centers centered all over the western part of the empire. Basically draw a line from Constantinople to the west, all of the Balkans to the north, Europe, and all of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, all of that territory, even up into Great Britain, all of that now just becomes chaos without the Roman legions to manage it, okay? And so you have all kinds of little power structures all over the place in very different kinds of place. What would arise, as I mentioned a moment ago, in this area is the Catholic Church. Okay? Now, we call it the Catholic Church with a capital C because that's its title, but Catholic means universal. So the original Catholic Church was the universal church that would grow up in that chaos. It would coalesce, if you will, in the midst of all that chaos, and you'll see why in a minute as we talk about some of the various hordes that will be coming in. You will see this coalescing take place in the West, and the church will sort of, the institutional Catholic Church as we know it, will sort of appear out of this hodgepodge of peoples all through this area. And it will grow, eventually, of course, centering itself in Rome, and it will introduce a new person into the game called the Pope. The papacy will be introduced in this particular period of time, in this tumultuous period of time. And here's what you need to remember. During this very tumultuous time of the Dark Ages, the rise of the church will be the institution that will start to bring peace back to this part of the world, as I said earlier. It is the institutional church and the papacy originally which will come to bear to bring forth order out of chaos, out of all this chaos. Interestingly enough, you'll put it this way, it'll be the Christian church that will bring order out of chaos in the political realm. Now that will become its greatest advantage and its greatest disadvantage. Because there's an old rule that says if you give men power, they're going to want to hold on to it, right? Okay. So what we're eventually going to be looking at as we move past the Dark Ages, we're going to be looking how the papacy itself is involved in this and how the popes are involved in bringing these sorts of things up, which I'll just stick in a footnote right here. When Fox News tries to tell you that the papacy is an unbroken line of men traced all the way back to Peter, they couldn't be more full of it. Because the papacy doesn't arise for hundreds of years after the early church and after the imperial church. So the papacy arrives in the Middle Ages, not at Peter. There is no way to trace an unbroken succession of popes all the way back to Peter, and any book that shows you a list is making it up from about 600 AD to about 30 AD. They're just making it up. Okay? All right, so let's talk about some of the invaders, shall we? All right, let's talk about those people. All right, because, again, the Dark Ages is marked by tumultuous war, and the problem is that the Roman Empire, again, before its fall, the Roman Empire was a place of great prosperity, right? It's a place where there's money and food and resources, and what happens when you have that? Everybody wants it, right? Everybody wants it. Okay. So the Roman Empire had successfully pushed back against the various barbarians from the north for a long period of time because it possessed the power to do so. The Roman legions were well known for going north into the Germanic territories and beating back the barbarians and establishing territories, even going so far, as we pointed out, all the way into Great Britain. You can go to Great Britain today and you can see Hadrian's Wall. So you can go all the way back to the times of Hadrian and see how the Roman Empire was very successful at pushing back. But as the empire begins to wane, as its political power is lessened, its military power is also lessened. This is, by the way, a lesson that we need to keep in mind. We need to always remember that nations that become decadent in their economic realities also become decadent in their military capabilities. It should not be a surprise to us that the American military is now dabbling with wokeism, because that's what happens. It's infectious. Okay? That's what happened in Rome. The decadence of the time led to a place where the armies of the Romans no longer felt it necessary to defend the borders. So what happens? Here come the barbarians. The barbarians are defined as invaders from the north who came to settle within the Roman Empire. What do they come looking for? They come looking for food. They come looking for places to live. They come looking for resources. So they come south from their territories in the north. Now, of course, the Romans consider them looters and destroyers. Obviously, if you're living in the land and someone's coming across your border to take your stuff, what do you consider them? You consider them a looter. Well, most people do. And I realize today there's a whole lot of people that don't. But for some reason, most Romans considered them to be looters and destroyers. And they did do a great deal of looting and destroying. There's no doubt of that. But most were looking to come to enjoy the benefits, to come and live in a prosperous place, which is the natural desire of all men. Okay. So there were a number of these various kinds of barbarians that came, all right? And they come down from the territories which we call the Germanic territories, okay? If you go due north of Rome, due north of Italy, into Europe, you will come to eventually to Germany, okay, what we call Germany today, right? The territory to the east of the Rhine River is considered the Germanic territories, okay? And so many of these barbarians were coming from that part of the world, coming south. Not a far journey, frankly, to come from Germany to Italy. I mean, you make that journey in a few days on foot probably, and by train you can make it in a day, okay? So they come. All right, so let's talk about some of them. First, we talk about the Vandals. That's with a capital V, okay? That's a title. They're the Vandals. They come from the area today known as Poland, and they come south to North Africa. They cross the Rhine. They go west across the Rhine in about 407. They wandered west through France and Spain. Okay, now, again, this is not one group of people all just moving en masse. Okay, we're talking about individuals coming with their families and coming with their stuff and moving. But there's sort of a general migration of these people over time. Okay, so they come across the Rhine. The first of them come across the Rhine in about 407. They wander through France and down into the Iberian Peninsula. And then they cross the Straits of Gibraltar, right, which you remember connects the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. So they cross that little short section of water there. And they come to the city of Carthage and take control of it in about 439. So in roughly 35 years or so, they come around from Poland through central Western Europe, across the Iberian Peninsula, south across the Straits of Gibraltar, over the northern part of Africa into Carthage. And they seized the city in 439. They then took to the sea and occupied Sicily and Corsica and Sardinia, and eventually make their way up the Italian boot until they get to Rome, sacking the city in 455. The Vandals were eventually conquered by the Byzantine Empire under Justinian. Remember I said Justinian was the guy in 565 that had the biggest expansion of the Byzantine Empire. This was part of his expansion. He conquered the Vandals, and the Vandals came under his authority. Now, here's what's interesting. When they come, many of them are already Christians. When they come, many of them are already Christians. Now, remember what we talked about when we talked about the expansion of the church in the previous section. Remember, the church went out to all parts of the world, and there were many who had come down from the north, from the Germanic territories, had come down into Rome during the imperial church, had been converted, and had gone back. And guess what they brought back with them? They brought back their Christianity with them. And so when they went back and preached the gospel in those places to their friends and their neighbors, and guess what? Many others were converted to faith. But, like so many others, the form of Christianity that they embraced during the imperial church would be Arian, because that was the dominant form of Christianity during the imperial church. Remember, it wasn't until late in the imperial church that Nicaea and Constantinople eventually addressed that. And so these earlier Vandals, these earlier migrations, had produced some believers who went back, converted, and then when the bulk of the Vandals decided, you know what, we had a famine, or we've got some problems here, or whatever. Frankly, it's warmer in Italy than here, so we're going there. So they make their way there. They're bringing their Christianity with them. They're bringing an Arian form of Christianity, okay? So it's important to remember that a lot of these folks, believe it or not, even as we call them barbarians, are actually believers. And they're not as awful as we make them out to be typically, because they do in fact hold to some kind of Christianity. Now, that doesn't mean they were all Christians. Okay. There were some. Okay. So we have the Vandals from Poland, then we have the Visigoths, sometimes just called the Goths. Okay. They come from the area northwest of the Black Sea. Today we call that area Bulgaria. And they made their way towards Spain. The Visigoths defeated the Romans at the city of Adrianople in 378. That's just west-northwest of Constantinople. If you see where Constantinople is, just move just to the west-northwest, you'll find the city of Adrianople there. They defeated the Romans at Adrianople in 378, and then they swept through the Balkans, and they took Rome in 410. So they were even earlier than the Vandals to Rome. It took the Vandals a lot more time, because they had to go all the way around this way, and the The Visigoths only had to come a short distance down here and then across, so it didn't take them as long. By 415, going the opposite direction from the Vandals, they went and occupied Spain. And they stayed there from 415 until the 8th century when they were overthrown by the Muslims. Now they too came with their form of Christianity, came with their form of Arian Christianity. So they brought their Arian Christianity with them. But many were converted to Catholic Orthodoxy, again, Western institutional Catholic Orthodoxy, after 589, when King Recared embraced Nicene Orthodoxy. Okay, so the church is acting already by the middle part of the 6th century, late part of the 6th century, as an instrument of conversion even at this point. Remember, as I said, what's the church going to do? The church is going to be the harbinger of orthodoxy. It's going to be the instrument in the West that's going to be holding orthodoxy. And so we're going to find the church, the very primitive Catholic Church, being an instrument, surprisingly to us, of orthodoxy. The very earliest part of the Catholic Church as we know it today actually held to orthodoxy and pushed back against Arianism in the barbarians as they came, specifically in the Visigoths as they came. So the church is not silent during this period of time. While the barbarians are beating at the gates, the church is busy. There are many of them that are coming with this incorrect form of Christianity. And they're being converted even as they're coming to overthrow cities and villages and places all through the area. Now that's kind of strange to us, sounds strange to us, but you have to remember there's a great deal going on back here in the background behind all of these things we're talking about. There's a lot of overlapping layers in all of this. In fact, the church herself acted as what's known as legislator for the Visigothic kingdom, providing order into the chaos. There were a number of councils that were noted for their attempts to organize life in this area in a Christian manner. The Christian church was busy. The Visigoths were overthrown by the Muslims in 711. But Christianity had become so rooted. Now, where we're at, by the way, I forgot to say something. Where the Visigoths, you remember, moved out of Rome over to the Iberian Peninsula into Spain. Okay? And that's where they set up camp. So this discussion of the Catholic Church bringing them back to orthodoxy is occurring in Spain, what we call Spain today, okay? And the church is acting sort of as a legislator for management of land in that space, okay? You'll notice how the church is now getting into political matters, all right? When the Muslims come in the early 700s, they come to overthrow the Visigoths in Spain. But Christianity had become so rooted in the country that it became the rallying point in the struggle to reconquer the peninsula from the Moors, from the Muslims. In fact, you know, today even, Spain is a highly Christian territory. Catholic Christian, anyways, okay? Because they took it back, eventually, from the Muslims. And this early Christianity that was there was the rallying cry. We were Christian. Take it back from the Muslims, was the idea. Okay? The next group is the Burgundians and the Franks. I always have a hard time saying Burgundians. They're from Burgundy. Okay, the Burgundians. The Burgundians and the Franks. They're from the Gaul. They're from Gaul. Gaul is the area of Europe east of the Rhine River. Okay, just east of the Rhine River. In the 5th century, it was divided between the Franks and the Burgundians. The Burgundians were Arians. Okay, many of them were Christian Arians, but the Franks were just flat-out pagans. All right? They didn't care. They had never embraced Christianity. I suspect the reason for that is because we don't see any reference to the Franks coming to Rome, into the Roman Empire prior to that. All right? But nonetheless, the Burgundians were Arians, the Franks were pagans. Around 496, under King Clovis, who was married to a Burgundian princess, the Franks converted to Christianity. Now, when I say converted to Christianity, I don't mean every single man all of a sudden became a believer. The nation became a Christian nation by virtue of the king becoming a Christian, and guess what happens to the people, okay? I.e. Constantine, right? In 516, under King Sigismund, the Burgundians converted to Nicene Orthodoxy. So they converted from Arian to Nicene. So you will notice, again, that although Arianism is still prevalent north of Rome, even though the Roman Empire has dealt with the issue of Arianism through the councils, that Arian Christianity has made its way out of Rome into all these other places, infecting all these other places. And now, as those peoples are moving around and dealing with things, they're slowly being converted to Orthodox Christianity. Athanasius' form of Christianity, an understanding of the Trinity in the way we understand it today. So in 534, the Burgundians were conquered by the Franks, and the church and the state in that territory became so intertwined that land holdings were connected to the office of bishop. The bishops virtually stopped being pastors and became lords. And what I mean by lords, of course, is in the feudal sense of the word. Land owners, such that individuals became serfs under these bishops. So you will notice that by the time you get to about 534, during this period, you're starting to see already the beginnings of an intertwining of the church and the state. The bishops are becoming powerful political men. And so even in places like this, very early in the Middle Ages, in the midst of the Dark Ages, you have this sense in which bishops are now stepping up to become political entities more than faith leaders and pastors. None of us would be able to get past the discussion of the barbarians without discussions of the Angles and the Saxons. They're from Northern Europe, and they come, of course, to Great Britain. The removal of Roman legions from the island brought these two groups across. The Angles and the Saxons invaded into the territory we now call, or the island we now call Great Britain, and established their 7 kingdoms. They were Germanic pagans. Okay, they were not Christians. Vast majority of them were just simple pagans, and so they come into Britain. Now, you remember the Isle of Britain is divided into 2 parts. You have the lower section, which is typically called Wales, and the northern section, which is typically called Scotland. How many of you have been there? You know it's Scotland. You should have just shouted it out. Scotland to the north, Wales to the south, and of course Ireland as a separate island off to the north and west, right? Okay. So the Irish church, you remember, was an important stronghold of Christianity during the fall of the Roman Empire. Remember, I pointed out last week that it was a lot of the old antiquities that had been brought from Rome to Ireland for protection. They were being studied in that place, but as it turned out to be a good place to protect them all. So you have a strong Irish church there. And so the Irish took it upon themselves to send missionaries into Scotland and eventually further into England itself. The hymn, "Be Thou My Vision," is a translation of a Celtic prayer, an Irish Celtic prayer, to thwart the evil influence of the pagan Celtic priests known as the Druids. It was originally written to that. We have redeemed it into a Christian hymn, but that's where it finds its roots. During this time, there were a number of unique practices which began in Ireland and spread into Scotland. Now, listen carefully to this list. In Ireland, there is some new practices that begin in the Christian church. First, private confession of sin to a priest. Okay? Monks becoming the head of the church rather than bishops. Remember, there was a strong monastic movement in Ireland. You remember on the map that you have, there's a whole lot of little monasteries pictured on the island, right? There was a strong monastic movement in Ireland, and so the result of that was that many monks became very powerful individuals by virtue of running their monasteries, and the result is many of them became the head of the church rather than bishops, which is upside down. The date of Easter was established during this period of time, which occurs on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. The first Sunday after the first full moon, after the first day of spring. So if you want to know when Easter's going to be, find the first day of spring on your calendar, March the 20th or 21st, right? Sometimes it's one or the other. Then find the next full moon, and then from there, come to the next Sunday. You're always wondering why it changes, aren't you? Because it's based on that formula. Works out every time. There was a full moon, was it last night or the night before? A couple of nights ago. I saw it out the front door of the house. I could see it shining right through the door. I'm going, the first full moon after the first day of spring, there it is. And therefore we have Sunday. Nope. Not connected to Passover. Mm-mm. Typically falls in the same time frame because it's always right in late March to early April, which is usually when Passover is. So there's a coincidence, but it's not based on that. And the performance of some other rites, okay? Now, all of this sort of unique practices that began in Ireland produced some conflict between the practices of the Scotch-Irish Church and the Western Church over time. The Scotch-Irish held to their ancient traditions. The Western missionaries insisted that their traditions came all the way from Peter, as we noted, holding the keys to the kingdom, their interpretation of Matthew 16 and Jesus' words saying, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and so forth. The Catholic Church would insist on themselves becoming the fundamental authority. The Scotch-Irish, not so much. You will notice they're kind of an independent folk, and so you have this sense in which there was constant strife. That becomes a real problem after the Reformation, of course. All right, so the Angles and the Saxons come, mostly Germanic pagans, but are converted to Christianity, many of them, by those from Ireland. Which leads us to the Ostrogoths and the Lombards. It's a little different from the Goths that I talked about earlier. These are coming from the Balkans to Italy. The last Roman emperor, a man by the name of Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 by Germanic invaders. That would be the official end of the Roman Empire. When the last emperor is gone, guess what? You don't have an empire anymore. Okay. So 476 is the official date of the fall of the Western Roman Empire under Romulus Augustulus. But another emperor at Constantinople, okay, in the eastern side, a man by the name of Zeno, overthrew the Ostrogoths and the Lombards who had come to overthrow this emperor. He overthrew them. And he did so using the East Germanic Ostrogoths, who were Asians. Aryans. Asians. They were Aryans. We'll talk about Asia later. They were Aryans as well. They had come down with their Christianity infected by Arianism like so many others, and they were then overthrown under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian early in the 6th century. By 568, the Lombards invaded Italy from the north, and as the power of Constantinople was declining in the east, the Italian peninsula was threatening to be overrun by the Lombards. So, while it's true to say that the Eastern Empire continued for a long period of time, its power rose very quickly up to the days of Justinian, and then began to wane very rapidly thereafter. So, Constantinople could not protect its western flank, which by this point is all the way into Italy. In other words, Constantinople's now taken that territory all the way to the west to Italy, through Greece and into Italy, and they couldn't protect their western flank any longer. They had lost their power as well. And so the Lombards are coming in, threatening to overrun the peninsula. So the Pope at the time turned to the Frankish kingdom for help. He turned to the Franks, looking for help from the Lombards coming in, which led to the crowning of Charlemagne by Pope Leo II as Emperor of the West on Christmas Day in the year 800. It's an easy date to remember, 12/25/800, okay? Now, let me tell you why I tell you that. I said you remember that the Dark Ages really is the period of time from about 450 or so, give or take, until 700, give or take, okay? All of these invasions are occurring during this period of time. There's people moving everywhere. There are issues going on all over the place. Various forms of Christianity are moving from here to there. Go all the way up to England, go into the Germanic territories coming south, going west into Spain and Iberian Peninsula, coming down into Africa, etc. All of this stuff on the western side of the empire. The eastern side is pretty stable. But the western side is having all of this issue. Okay. And you remember I said at the beginning that it was going to be the rise of the Catholic Church up in this space to sort of bring some normalcy and some order to this. Well, it's really going to start with Charlemagne. He's going to be the guy. He's going to be the one to become the first emperor of a new Western Empire, which will be called the Holy Roman Empire. Notice its name, Holy Roman Empire. It's finding its source in the church. That's why a pope puts the crown on Charlemagne's head, because it is a pope who is establishing an emperor. By the way, who's in charge? Right? You know the answer. The pope, because he's the guy putting the crown on the other guy. Okay, so what the point is that as you get to the beginning of the 9th century, 800, you're seeing now a rise of a new empire which will bring the Dark Ages to an end. Because it will be Charlemagne and his forces which will end all of this invasion, all of these barbarians at the gates. He's the one that's going to bring order out of chaos in this whole area. But he's going to be doing it, you will notice, under the church. So you will see how now, so you're getting a picture, you should be getting a picture of how it is that in the West, Christianity became foundational to Western civilization. Because the very essence of Western civilization was the church that started it, the church that undergirded it, the church that rose up in this period of time to bring order out of chaos. So that's the reason why Muslims, by definition, just a knee-jerk reaction, assume that everybody in the West is a Christian. Because this is fundamentally where Western civilization starts. It starts with the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. And that Holy Roman Empire will occupy all of Europe and Italy and even parts and even parts of Africa, but it will be mostly in Europe. Western civilization is there, okay? Now, let me talk about the reality of this period of time by way of review. Okay, from the 5th to the 8th century, Western Europe was swept by a series of invasions. These invasions destroyed a great deal of classical antiquity, culture and learning, the arts, urban living, all those kinds of things destroyed by these hordes of barbarians moving through and sacking cities and burning down villages and all these sorts of things and taking over lands and killing people and all these sorts of things. So we call this the Dark Ages because it's this period of sweeping invasions coming through. And interestingly enough, these invasions bring in hordes of Christians or supposed Christians who are holding to Arian forms of Christianity or pagans, of course, as well, sweeping into these territories. But what becomes the reality is that the invaders are eventually converted to the faith of those they conquer. They come in to conquer, and they go away as Christians. They go away as people embracing the faith of Christianity. So the church rises up in this period of time. It becomes an instrument by which order is restored and peace is restored. But it begins to be changed through these events, including, as I pointed out at the beginning, the rise of the papacy, the rise of a pope who would be the central bishop of the church, Up until now, each individual city had its own bishop, each individual church had its own bishop who led that particular church. There would be people helping him and serving him, but he was the primary guy in that place. You remember Athanasius. Athanasius eventually became a bishop, right? And so forth. But now you're going to see the rise of a single bishop who's going to stand over all the other bishops to become the de facto leader of the church originally and then an official leader of the church later. Now, I would argue that the papacy, the original rise of the popes during this particular period of time, was originally a function of the providence of God in preserving the wisdom of the ancient past. At the beginning, you remember I said the popes were responsible for maintaining orthodoxy. And at the very beginning, they did so. Many of these pagans who came in as Arians were eventually converted to Nicene orthodoxy. They eventually became true Nicene believers. Who's doing that? Well, that's being done by the church, being led by the early popes. But that office and the church itself morphed over time into a position of power within the political landscape of the time, and therefore wound up moving beyond the bounds of orthodoxy. Didn't stay orthodox, because that's one of the problems when you hand men power. They will pervert that power. Thus, the Dark Ages comes to an end with the rise of a combined force between the church and the state, a man by the name of Charlemagne, and continues to change in theology over time as that combination wears away at orthodoxy. The combination of the state and the church, the Pope as the leader of the church, and an emperor established by the church as the leader of the state, those two things are going to wear away at the totality of orthodoxy over time. It's only a matter of time. It is inevitable that it will occur. Now, just so you know, remember, everything on the east is relatively stable. Constantinople is maintaining its empire for another 1,000 years. So the church in the east does not face this struggle. The invaders remain largely in Europe, and the Eastern Church doesn't have to deal with this struggle between the church and the state. They're still able to separate themselves as a church from the emperors who established themselves in Constantinople. Justinian, of course, in the middle of the 6th century being the guy that leads to the largest expansion of the Eastern Empire. But the church isn't intertwined in that same sense, as it will be in the West, okay? And that is why, by the way, the vast majority of people in the West have almost no knowledge of the church in the East. It's almost as though most Americans, if you told them that there was a third branch of Christianity, they'd look at you and go, really? I've never heard that before. I mean, yeah, I've heard of Greek Orthodox, but I didn't know that was a third branch. Yeah, there's an Eastern branch of the church that's going to remain relatively stable, which is why those who are part of the Eastern Church today will tell you that their liturgies and their beliefs trace all the way back to the days of Constantine, all the way back to the Council of Constantinople, all the way back there. In fact, many Eastern Orthodox will not even consider themselves Chalcedonian Christians, because the Council of Chalcedon will be a Western problem. And many Easterners will say, that's not our council. They call themselves non-Chalcedonian Christians. Okay? We'll talk about what that means later. All right? So the Eastern Church, stable, finding its roots going way back. The Western Church, turmoil. Massive amounts of turmoil that's going to continue all the way through the Middle Ages, through the Reformation, and into today. Okay? You might say that the Roman Church is a boiling cauldron and the Eastern Church is just a pot of water on the stove that hasn't even been turned on yet. Basic imagery. All right? So the Middle Ages will come to an end with the rise of men to attempt to reform the church and its popish leadership back to the orthodoxy they originally held. Men like Luther will look at the Pope and say, your progeny was at one time faithful. You need to return to what your original progeny believed. That's why we call it a reformation. Reform that which was lost. Okay? Because There was a time when the Catholic Church was faithful and orthodox, but it's been lost. So the importance of the Dark Ages would be these things. Number one, in his sovereignty, God has purpose for the church in the West to struggle through these invasions. But the invasions would bring Christianity to the whole of Europe. All of Europe, these struggles would come. And it would bring the church to a consistency of orthodox thinking at the beginning. Now, yes, there will still be some struggles with a few things involving the nature of Christ and so forth, and we'll be looking at those shortly. But fundamentally, the church in the West, the sovereignty of God was such that God purposed for the invasions to happen, for the fall of the empire to occur, in order that that would produce a bomb going off with Christianity going all over Europe. It would no longer be just limited to the churches in the Roman areas, and then we just leave the Arians in the north alone. Nope. There's a sense in which the church would explode out of Rome all over Europe. And so, although political systems and nations come and go, the church continues on. The faithfulness of God is such that even in the midst of the Dark Ages, there is still a faithful remnant of believers throughout all of Europe. By definition, we know that the church is distinct from political systems, or at least it ought to be. What we're going to discover is that not going to be the case as we go along, because the church has its own king. The church is a part of a larger movement of that king to establish a worldwide system of governance, and a governance that is greater than the church herself. The kingdom of God is not the church. The kingdom of God is established over the entire earth to encompass not only the elect, but also all of creation itself, which Paul tells us in Romans is groaning, waiting for its redemption. The kingdom of God is coming. So what we have here then is the initial aspects of the church blowing out of Rome into all of Europe and establishing itself. But then we also will see, unfortunately, of course, the degradation of the church when it intertwines itself with political systems, and what's going to happen as a result of that, which needed to be addressed some 1,000 years later. For example, we're going to find that popes become more wards of the state than theologians. They become more functional politicians than they do theologians. I give you the one currently seated in the Vatican as Exhibit A on that account. So it behooves us to be very careful how we connect the church with the state and how we understand the connection between those two things. Okay? So I hope that what you've noticed tonight is that there was a short period of time, short from God's perspective, not from ours, 250 years, in which there was this massive upheaval on the Roman side of the empire, resulting in all of Europe being swept by barbarians, bringing both paganism and Christianity in various forms to many, many places. But eventually the church rises out of the ashes of that invasion to become a functionary of peace and order and structure, which will then lead to the very establishment of Western civilization itself over the next 1,000 years of time. Any questions? Yes?
During the time when the church was being turned down, I guess the church found around through Palestine and then through Africa, were the Jews exiled during all that?
Oh yes, the Jews had been dispersed in 70 AD, and they're living all over the place. Right, no. There's always been fights over the Holy Land for a long, long time. I think at this time, though, under the thumb of Constantinople, much of that territory was just like any place else. It really wasn't treated as anything different. Jerusalem has always been a holy city and treated that way, but it was never really considered important. It will become one later, of course, particularly as the Muslims come to take over Palestine. And by the way, just to make one correction to the way that you put that, Constantinople, the Eastern Empire, really didn't sweep through and take it all. It was simply there by the time that the western side fell. Because remember, Constantine, by moving his headquarters to Constantinople, to Byzantium, and renaming it, he already had inherited that territory in that space from his predecessors. Because the Roman Empire, remember, has existed from before the time of Christ. And so the territory all the way from Great Britain to the Mediterranean basin, Italy, Greece, Spain, Italy, Greece, into Turkey, around, and all of that was already Roman territory. Obviously, Jesus lived under the Roman Empire in his days. So Constantinople didn't have to go through and take it. They already owned it. It was already their territory. So they just simply held on to it. The control of it shrank over time, but they continued to control that crescent there until 1454. I just wanted to make sure that people didn't understand that as though the Eastern Empire went on a crusade to take that territory. No, they already owned it. They had owned it for centuries. Yeah. Oh yeah, oh absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 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 yeah. The Muslims will invade, and they'll be fought off, and then they'll invade, and we'll find a lot of that. And of course, we'll talk about the Crusades. You know, we'll talk about the Christian attempts to retake Palestine after the Muslims take it and so forth. So there's a whole lot of discussion in all of that. So there's always been a debate over who owns the Holy Land, because remember, Muslims, Jews, and Christians are all Abrahamic faiths. They're all flowing from Abraham. So the assumption is that if this land was given to Abraham and we're the progeny of Abraham, then it's our land. So both Muslims and Jews make that assumption. Muhammad's in the 600s, I believe. Yeah, this is not too far. This is not too far before Islam appears, and we'll be talking about Islam, and it's no, it's the same thing. Yeah, Muslims are people who believe in the Islamic religion. Yeah, no, a Muslim is a person. Islam is a religion. Yes. Well, the Greek Orthodox is a part of the Eastern Church. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, there's a whole bunch of different versions. Yes. You know, I'm not exactly sure of that. Correct. The spread of Christianity and Orthodoxy in that direction, I'm not exactly sure that can be related to any particular event, just the typical migration of people going in that direction. I did mention the Balkans, which is, you know, just to the west of the Black Sea, north and west of the Black Sea, that territory there, which is, of course, was under Soviet control and now has gone back to being standard control. Well, I'm talking about Bulgaria and then the Slavic territories. Okay, so if you go off in that direction towards Russia, it's highly likely that many of these barbarians who came into that territory and were repelled by Constantinople, some probably went and continued west towards Rome, and others probably went back in the other direction. And again, what would they be doing? They'd be looking for land, resources. So there's probably a great deal of migration going in that direction, bringing the Eastern version of Christianity that way. That would be my guess. I would have to look that up in more detail, but that's the most logical explanation. Yes, correct. As Protestants moved into, as Protestantism took hold in the Russian territories, yes, that would be the logical thing. The Eastern Orthodox Church would say, hey, that's inconsistent with us. This is territory of the East, not territory of the West. Take your Western religion and get out. The Great Schism in 1054 will be the break between the two, officially, in which they will no longer see themselves as one church. But we'll come to that later. I'm not exactly sure. I have to go look. We'll come to that. I have a lecture on that. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I have to go back and look at what is considered to be the first pope and when he's coming. I mean, we know we already have a pope by 800 because of Charlemagne, Pope Leo II, so there was a Leo I apparently. By the way, Pope Leo X was the guy that Luther struggled with.
Okay, so you just said that the Eastern Orthodox would tell the Protestants that they don't want that kind of
Correct.
thing and so on. But what
So would the Catholics.
more unlike than the
Actually, no. What you're going to see is that the eastern side of the church, tracing its roots all the way back into the imperial church time, is going to diverge also its own way from orthodoxy. And so in many ways, Catholicism and orthodoxy are similar, and yet in many ways they are different. One of the ways that they're similar is that they have both lost the idea of justification by faith alone. However, I'm willing to grant the Orthodox a bit more leniency in my condemnation of their theology because they actually can trace their roots all the way back. And you can show that Eastern Orthodoxy has attempted to keep the faith through those periods of times. But at the same time, I would argue that Eastern Orthodoxy has just as much of a problem with losing its way on theology, on soteriology particularly, and Christology, than the West did. Problem was there was no Protestant movement in it to bring it back. God never raised up a Protestant movement in it to restore it to its place. I think what he did, if I might just speculate on God's mind here for a moment, I think what he did was created a Protestant movement in the West and sent it into the East. Because guess what? The Protestant movement didn't reform the church in the West, so let's give it a try in the East. The goal was never to reform the church in the West, but simply to establish the proper church over against the Catholic Church. So we'll let the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodoxy go their way. But again, I'm just speculating. Any other questions? All right, I appreciate you coming out tonight. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to continuing our discussion of the medieval church as we go along.